the second day of the parallel events in conjunction with the Standard Forms of Building Contracts Forum 2022. My name is Lee Kai Jun, and I will be your MC for these sessions. Now, today we are giving away 5 virtual passes for the forums. Each virtual passes is worth 60 ringgit. All you have to do is, number 1, attend this webinar. Number 2, tell us who is the author of the book Standard Forms of Building Contracts Compact via WhatsApp at 011 5113 5002 at the end of this webinar by 12:30 p.m. together with your full names and email addresses, and follow L2 icon linking page for the giveaway announcement. Now, to kickstart the sessions of the day, AIAC contract clauses contractor must know, I would like to first invite Swee Im as our moderators for these sessions. Swee Im needs no introductions, but please allow me to share a short one. Swee Im is chartered arbitrators, adjudicators, and an accredited mediator with principal focus on the constructions, infrastructures, and energy sectors. She's currently an international arbitrators member at 39 Isacc chambers, and she has just been appointed as a member of the Asian International Arbitration Center Advisory Council recently. Swee Im, the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Kaijun. Thank you very much to L2 LexisNexis and Legal Plus and everybody else for being here. But most importantly, thank you all of you for joining us on this webinar on a weekday at 11 a.m. in the morning. This is for those who are in Malaysia and Singapore, and for those of you who are from anywhere else in the world, a very good day to you. So today we'll be dealing with the AIAC standard form of contracts. We are one in a series of building forms that are being considered this week. And with us today, we'll have Isacc Sunder Rajan, if I can get Isacc to turn on his video. We also have Shee, please to turn on your video as well. And last but not least, Louise Azmi. So to kick off this whole thing before we hear from the various speakers, first of all, I have to declare my interest in this. And if you think that there is a conflict of interest and I should be kicked off this webinar, you should say so very, very soon. The interest that I want to declare is the fact that, as Kaijun said, I am a member of the AIAC Advisory Council. But secondly, I'm also a member of the AIAC Advisory Committee for these standard forms of contract. So in that sense, I really have a vested interest in these contracts. But be that as it may, the most important thing is that we're all here to learn together, to get the feedback, and to together improve on this. So quick overview of the SFC. Now, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to share on the chat, in the chat function there, the link to where you can find this AIAC Standard Forms Contract, SFC. This is what we're calling it. And the difference is that the fact that it's very, very unusual for an arbitral institution to be developing a standard form of contract. And the then director, Dr. Sunder Raju, will tell you that this was actually a root and branch attempt to actually avoid disputes rather than just to resolve disputes, which is what AIAC is normally associated with. If you look into this link that I just have shared with you, this is the SFC website, you will look to see that there are a few key features that they highlight. And let me just highlight one of them, which is that it clearly sets up accountability between employer and contract administrator. It also stipulates specific time periods for parties to carry out obligations under the SFC. I always have a problem with that. The other thing that you will see listed in there, just on the landing page, will be the benefits. And some of the benefits are the fact that it is a unified contract. It is a very unusual contract insofar as those of you who are familiar, this is a hybrid of with and without quantities, which is pretty unusual as you can imagine. Now, the other things that they list as benefits are introduction of contract administrator, greater transparency, enhanced clarity, party autonomy, it's CIPA compliant, and there's a greater focus on continuity of projects. So like I said, I mean, the whole idea here is actually to try and avoid, if you can, the disputes rather than purely to resolve them. So to kick this off, what we have, we've got 3 esteemed speakers today, all good friends of mine and all very, very respected colleagues, and everybody, all of them I've known for a long time and worked very closely with. What's interesting is the fact that we've got a speaker from the consulting side of the industry. We've got another speaker who represents a contractor, and the third speaker who is from the legal industry. So we've got a very nice a balance of views with regards to this particular contract. Now, to kick us off, I'm going to ask Daniel, the tech moderator, to please run the first poll question. Now, there's over 100 of you out there. Please, will you try and answer this question for us? And we will leave this question up for about 30 seconds. Whilst you're answering this question, let me quickly introduce the 3 speakers. I'm not going to go into detail because their full profiles are available, and actually all of them are pretty well known within the industry. Well, first and foremost, we'll have Isacc Rajan. Isacc is, like I said, from the consulting industry. He's a project manager, a consultant, chartered building engineer. And Isacc is a familiar face around the AIAC and in the dispute resolution world. By profession, he's actually a QS. Next up, we'll have Shee. Shee is from the Sunway Group, and Sunway Group as in contractor. And Shee is also representing the Master Builders Association. And he will look at things from the opposite end of where Isaac's coming from, the contractor who's always been bullied. And last but certainly not least, we have Louise Azmi. Louise is a lawyer, and she is well known amongst our circles for having co-authored the book on mediation. It's one of the major books on mediation in Malaysia. And Louise has got the distinction of being one of the very few Matsales, one of the very few Guailos, one of the very few foreigners, so to speak, who is called to the bar in Malaysia and practices as an advocate and solicitor of the High Court of Malaya. So to everybody, well, please welcome our 3 speakers. I hope that by now you would have answered the question, the poll question. And Daniel, is it possible for us to have the result of it? Thank you. So the question that we posed by way of a poll question is, have you considered using the AIAC standard form of contract on your project? And you want to answer either yes, no, or that you didn't know about the existence of the AIAC standard form of contract. Now, what is absolutely interesting is the fact that 26% have considered it, 36% have not considered it, but almost the same percentage, 38%, don't even know the existence of this form of contract. So this is an interesting one because Isacc, Stephen, and Louise, your work is cut out for you. You need to tell the 38% who are out there, and I'm sure there are many more people out there who don't know much about this contract, the good, the bad, the ugly, and what we can do with it. So, ladies and gentlemen, to kick this off, I remind you again, to the 38% who don't know about this contract, do look up the chat box. The link is there. You can download everything for free, and you can have a look at it in your own time. I'll give you a quick hint. When you look at the table of contents, you may think it looks terribly familiar. You may think that this is basically a PAM form. I can confess to you that that was my initial thought. But when we did a word compare version between PAM and the AIAC standard form, you'll be amazed at how much there are in terms of the differences between the 2 forms. So let's kick off with Isacc. Isacc, you are Mr. Consultant here. Yeah? You are normally in the driver's seat. You're the one normally, or you and your cohort are the ones who are normally driving which form of contract there is to be used. So let's just start off with generally speaking, from your perspective as a consultant, do you think that the provisions of the AIAC form are helpful or a hindrance?
Thank you, Swee Im. Hey, I currently work as a consultant, but I started out in the construction industry as contractors, and then I moved on to consultancy in the 90s. So substantial part of my work has always been in consultancy, and then lately dispute resolution. So it gives me a wide spectrum of contracts that's being used and the problems that generally arise. Now, basically, if you look at the industry, the government contracts are separate from the private sector. So you have the government side, basically, if they are GLCs or even the government proper will have to use the Public Works Department, PWD 203. There's no way out of it. As far as the private sector is concerned, they have always, they initially started with the PAN-69, which is in turn based on the KTC, British contract, 1963. And for a long time, that contract was used. And of course, in that contract, it gives prominence to the SO. In the private sector, is what you call generally is the architect. Of course, in the public sector, the government, the SO is actually the engineer. But for us, for today, I think basically we like to talk about the private sector, which forms are as used. In the beginning, there was practically no choice for the industry, and therefore the PAN-69 used to be the premier contract form used for a very long time, up until the 80s, and then you have a particular professor was actually brought in by PAN to review the conditions, because the conditions were not so easily understood by the parties involved and their rights and obligations. And he is Vincent Powell Smith. He was brought in to actually review the contract forms, and he made some suggestions which ultimately was the issue of 98 PAN formula. Now, going back to AIAC form of contract, which actually is modeled on the PAN forms. So if I were to actually look at it, and the general trend of now being very prescriptive, procedural, it's nothing new in the industry. It has been evolving over the years from the 80s and 90s and the current century. So there seems to be a trend, as well as there's a trend of buildings and projects being more sophisticated. If in the early days of 60s and 70s, projects were actually very simplistic, individual projects. Today you have massive projects, infrastructure projects, as well as buildings which are very complex. So what used to be accepted and worked well, the PAN suite of contracts are now being tested, to the fringes of it. So the current AIAC form of contract actually takes upon the PAN form, and then it develops further and becomes a bit more, shall we say, instead of using the word prescriptive, I would say standard operating procedures are actually placed so that parties are clear about it. Because today, almost everybody talks about SOPs and standard operating procedures. So it is in line with the current thinking of the public. Easy for them to understand. There's a book there, there's a manual there that actually gives the SO or the CA direction on how to handle the project fairly. Because when usually the SO of a project, the architect, or even the CA, which we are now promoting, uses his own experience and all that. But lately, I think because of the wide range of projects, it's not so easy to get very experienced SOs or CAs. So you have a contract form that is very effective and that gives him the guideline, and he won't go wrong far. So in that sense, I think the contract form that has been used is sort of a right form. So now, as regards as a consultant, what sort of contract that you would recommend? So it all depends on the project. If you are doing government projects, then of course we have choice. You have to recommend Public Works Department 203, or is already imposed on us. But if you are doing a private job, depends on the size of the job. So, but of course, AIAC covers a whole lot for minor works. And also, there are also other forms of contracts available in the industry, like the CIDP 2000, which is also appears to be drawn along the similar lines of the AIAC contract. So if you look at the AIAC form of contract, one of the flexibilities it offers is that it provides a clause for CA appointment. And I remember during my practice that we used to do jobs for banks, as a consultant, and also we also manage their works. So when it comes to, say, an ID job, an interior design job of some substantial size, the SO that we would like to have there is actually the interior design architect. So some of them are actually qualified architects, some of them are actually pure interior designers, but they are the one who actually should oversee the projects. So it gives the flexibility of who you want to choose. It's not by default that the architect goes. So that allows the industry to place the right person there with that relevant experience to guide the project. So that flexibility is actually given in the AIAC form of contract. And of course, also the sort of a risk allocation. Now, one of the problems of having a very prescriptive form of contract, from my point of view, is that when the parties see, especially the contractors, he would actually price his tender according to the type of form of contract. So if it's very prescriptive, he knows that he has not much way to slack or do things that it's not according to contract. So he would actually price. So invariably, what happens? I mean, in theory, all projects must be done properly according to spec. But once he sees that it's very prescriptive, there is a chance that he would actually price that as a risk. There's a risk that, of course, one may say that well, if you have very prescriptive, then you would think that you can price it much more lower. But this is something that the industry has to actually try to adjust. But my experience is that when contractors actually price for things, they look at who is the SO, who is the CA, and if it's a person of such a reputation that to be very strict, and then of course the pricing also goes up. So when you have a very prescriptive form and it involves a lot of paperwork to be done, of course there is a slight, it would probably cause a slight increase in tender price. But that's my view on it. Now, specifically, I mean, if you say that there are the clauses, what are good clauses and what are bad clauses, I don't think there's any particular clause that I consider it bad, but I would think that that there are certain clauses that I'm quite happy to see that the use of mediation is actually drafted into it. Only thing is that probably you have to make it mandatory that mediation is the first action to be taken. We proceed to other forms because it is less adversarial and is in line with Asian way of thinking, and don't want to, I mean, contractors really don't want to fight with the developer or the main or the subcontractor that doesn't want to fight with the main contractor. They are there to finish a contract. So in that sense, I see there's some good points that we raised. Then the effects of SEPA also is incorporated into the contract, so it's quite clear. You know, if the contractor gets a SEPA decision, what is he supposed to do? You know, and if the SO is not guided, then he may also run astray. So some of these things that that I would like to say that it is actually good for. I think I've run out of time, Swee Im. That's about it that I think I have to say. Thank you, Swee Im.
Thank you very much. I know
Yeah.
you've used the word prescriptive a few times.
Yes.
And I wonder whether you'd like to comment on whether that aspect of it or that description of it would actually be seen as beneficial by the consultants and the CA and the CA team in particular, on the basis that, as you said, it might actually help them.
Okay, it's that thing is it's good, but I mean, in a way, the CA and the prescriptive part of it need to be actually separated. In fact, I have said this before, that the entire role of the SO cannot be taken over by the CA. There are some statutory functions of the what do you call SO that cannot be relieved from him. But of course, when it mentions, I mean, I find that this document that we have prepared here in AIAC also, it's good that they actually establish the roles of the consultants also quite clearly, and that is one of the advantages of using this form. Yeah. Yes, Swee Im. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So what we'll do is that we'll move on now to the other side of the table, so to speak. The guy who's always negotiating with the consultants, the guy who's always trying to get paid, the guy who's always trying to build a project. And we have Shee, who looks at this contract from the perspective as a contractor. Stephen, what do you like? What can you tell us about this?
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Swee Im, and thank you for the organizers for having me here. I'm here as an independent contractor here to this morning. First, the topic that I've been asked to look at is the AIAC SFC form, which includes the BQ and the lump sum type of contract. I think the details of the particular clause is in the link shared by Swee Im just now, so I would not bother myself bringing you through it because it's 2 pages long, and if I read that, it will take up all my time here already. So the contract that AIC talks about actually comprise of 2 types, a lump sum, bills of quantities, and a hybrid of the 2. And as for the fixed price lump sum contract, some salient terms, it shall not be adjusted or altered. Any errors in the price and rates in the schedule shall be corrected or rationalized without any changes to the lump sum. And quantities in the bills of quantities and the prices and rates in the schedule shall be used as reference only, even though it's incorporated into the contract. And the fixed firm lump sum shall be deemed to include all ancillary and other works and expenditure which may or may not be mentioned or described in the contract documents, but which are indispensable or necessary to bring the works to completion. Wow, that's a very mouthful. I would prefer to describe it in a local lingo, which 包咖料啦, basically is that, and it's 包山包海, you just got to do everything. And the bills of quantities. One salient term is that quantities of works executed is all subject to remeasurement. And in the AIAC form, it goes on to describe how the works are to be remeasured and how it's to be valued. For example, taking one as an example, where work is of a similar character or similar conditions, and the quantity is not changed by, if it's not stated, is by default is 12%, although there are contracts using 20%, from the quantity, the rates and prices in the BQ and applicable schedule shall determine the valuation. This is one of the scenario. The second scenario is where work is of similar character, but is not executed under similar conditions. And there's a second limb to it. If it's executed under similar conditions, but the quantity of work is changed by more X percentage, if it's not stated, it's again 12%. The rates and prices in bills and quantities and applicable schedule shall be the basis of determining the valuation, and we shall include a fair adjustment of the rates to consider such differences. And another scenario, the third scenario, where work of a different character of the work as set out in the contract, the valuation shall be at fair market rates as determined by the CA. And one more, where work cannot be properly measured or valued in accordance with the above, then you'll be allowed day work rates plus 15%. Then there's the last category, where it's a mixture of the two or a Rajan of the two, of a lump sum and remeasurement, then the aggregate of the sums referred to by the rules of the contract, all right? Then there's a table that's provided under clause article 3.2, where you have to fill out the amounts and details of the scope of work. And this have to be carefully filled in. If not, it's going to cause a lot of confusion and more disputes for Louise to solve later on, maybe. Okay, now, why is the BQ and LS in the same form? I would say it's a departure from the conventional separate forms. It's good in the sense because it cuts the needs for separate forms where only one or two or maybe three clauses differentiate one from the other. And the not so good part about it, of this fusion is it may cause confusion as a result of fusion, hence more dispute if the customization and contract administration is not done properly. Now, ACSFC is considered to be full of procedural requirements. Is that the case? A quick browse through the form will illustrate that. You see, look at clause 2.4 instruction, clause 3.7 work program, clause 11 variations, 23 EOT, 24 loss and expense, and 37, which runs through the whole form already. It shows there are a lot of procedural and prescriptive, if I may borrow Isaac's words just now, on the procedures to be complied. The trailer at the start of this sessions today says drafting a contract is not easy. As a contractor, complying with all the procedures is never easy too. Okay, now, procedure requirements may be viewed as technicalities, but at times cannot be avoided when you need to play a game. Whether a form, a standard form, whatever is it, works out to the expectations of the players would depend how the game is played. If I may just quote an illustration, you see, if I just use clause 11.1, it gives the definition of variations, 11.6 valuation of variations, 11.7 variation rules, which is similar to the article 3.1b, which I've spoken very briefly just now, and 11.8 additional expenses caused by variations. In clause 11, procedural rules are necessary to establish if it's a variation, and if it's a variation, how the valuation is to be done. What if a contractor incurred expenses for which he would not be paid under any provisions of clause 11.7 and clause 24? Clause 11.9 is the saving clause subject to the contractor having given written notice, intention to claim, initial estimates, 28 days later, the particulars. However, if the contractor fails to submit the required particulars within 28 days, contractor is said to have waived his rights. Fair, unfair, something to think about. If the contractor submits insufficient particulars, the CA may assess its discretion and value the contractor's claim for such additional expenses based on the information available to him. Here is the case of a CA's discretion whether to assess or value it to give it a technical dismissal or technical knockout. Another example is clause 24.1a, Romans 3, AIAC form again. If the contract fails to submit, it shall be deemed that the contractor has waived his rights under the contract and or at law. Now, the procedural clauses are really necessary, especially, are the procedural clauses really necessary, especially in publicly acknowledged events like the MCO, CMCO, RMCO, Emergency Ordinance, and the whole list of them, and more recently, the 18 December 21 floods, which was described as a 1 month's rainfall in 1 day, a once-in-a-century event in an article. In another article, it was stated as the occurrence of the word floods ever seen in 15 years. This flood affair brings me to the definition of exceptionally adverse weather conditions in the AIAC SFC form, which is defined as a condition of weather on a day before the completion date for the whole of the works in the area of or nearby the site within the month, the value by comparison, less the weather data is shown to occur on average frequently than once in 10 years. I would say kudos to the auditors for such foresight. It is very useful now. Okay, now, one last part before I conclude because of my limitation of time. Clause 30.7 allows suspension of works due to non-payment. If, as a contractor, I would love that clause a lot. And I'm also asked, as a contractor, would I push my client to use the AIAC SFC form? Why not? Is CIPA compliant, as seen in clause 23A and 24A? However, contractor, being the downstream player, can only wish, but cannot dictate which form the contractor wants to use. More so in a competitive market, you tender on these terms, no negotiation, take it or leave it. I think that's the reality of the day. In any standard form, then there will be amendments and customization process where due care has to be taken in the process to avoid any undesired consequences. Quite common, a clause is amended, but consequential changes are not made, and that's where the problem starts. However, one wish for AIAC, if clients can discover and seek out the AIAC SFC form on its own, then I would say the AIAC SFC would have achieved its objective and you are home. Okay, one last thing, one last comment. What would I want to change? As a contractor, in my view, I think for public acknowledged events like what I've said just now, the pandemic, epidemic, MCOs, and the floods, I think, is it really necessary to give notices and particulars when it's so available in the market? It's such a, it's just like failure to give notice of particulars should not be deemed as a waiver or non-compliant, but be given due recognition by the contract administrator itself. Of course, unless the contractor is default for some other events not related, which then is for fair deal. I think in such cases, automatic and universal extension of time should be given and maybe cost to be shared. That's my parting words. Thank you, Swee Im.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Spoken like a true contractor, very, very practical. If there's a flood, there's a flood, there's a flood. Why do I need to give you notice, right? In fact, I can't even get to my office to give you the notice, which is one of the things that was always discussed very much during the MCO as well. But we'll come back to discuss some of these points, which are sort of a counter to what Isaac was talking about. Let's hear from Louise first. Louise, I mean, you've got the consultant who quite likes the fact that he's got the contract administrator. It gives him a bit of latitude. Quite likes the fact that he's got quite a lot of guidance. Stephen, the contractor, says, you know, there are a lot of good things about it, but it's a flood. But you and I know at the end of the day, it's still going to go wrong. There's still going to be fights. There's still going to be disputes. They've been trying to put us lawyers out of work for a long time, but I don't think anybody has succeeded, you know. So given the stated intent of the AIAC standard form contract to try to avoid disputes, not just resolve them, give us your take as a lawyer, and in particular with regards to dispute resolution or dispute avoidance, shall I say.
Yeah. Thank you, Swee. I think, as you rightly say, there'll always be disputes, and attempts to put us lawyers out of business has so far failed. But when you come to look at the standard form contract, AIAC standard form contract, I think there are a lot of very good things in it that seek to avoid disputes happening. And primarily, I think the degree of specificity is key and very important, because this is a contract where roles are clearly defined under the contract, so that if somebody is not fulfilling their obligations or responsibilities, that should be readily apparent. There's clear time limits, there's clear processes. So at least I think that gives everybody a clear sense of what they should be doing when, and who owes obligations and responsibilities to whom at what time. Now, whether people actually comply with those responsibilities is, of course, a different and separate question. But certainly, if you enter into this form, I think that's something that's a huge advantage. Now, what I would say to anybody entering into a contract is do the work up front to understand, firstly, whether it's suitable for your particular type of the particular job that you're carrying out, and secondly, that you understand your duties and obligations under the contract, because you can imagine as lawyers, we frequently have clients come to us who say, you know, they might come with a very compelling and convincing case, but they've clearly not understood things like, or not even looked into things like time limits. Have they served notices? Have they kept documents? And although arbitrators can sympathize and empathize with people's position, there's very little that they can do if evidence isn't presented. And so I completely understand what Stephen says, and I know that a lot of these procedural requirements can be seen as an obstacle to actually getting the job done. But it's fundamentally important in terms of then subsequently coming to enforce your legal right and to get what you're owed. So this is a standard form. Maybe what we're going through at the moment with pandemics and floods is not what might be described as standard. But in typical times, compliance with these things is absolutely fundamental, because the courts have also shown that they're not going to give passes where people haven't complied with the obligations under the contract. So instead of spending a lot of money at the end of the contract to resolve all the disputes that have arisen, I would advise anybody to spend a little bit of money at the outset to get somebody to advise you clearly on exactly what needs to be done under the contract, and to advise your personnel similarly, and make sure they're doing what needs to be done. Stephen touched on how this form is SIPA compliant, which again I think is something very positive in terms of keeping cash flow moving and giving contractors rights to enforce their adjudication decisions. So in two key respects, it's SIPA compliant. The first is the right to suspend works, and the second is a gloss on direct payment from the principal. So what should happen under the contract where the employer has made payment on behalf of the contractor to the subcontractor. So SIPA gives rights where you've got an adjudication decision in your favour that's not been made good on by the unpaid party. There's a right under SIPA to slow down or suspend work, and a right for an extension of time and loss and expense as a consequence of the same. But parties have historically been very reluctant to go down that road, because you can imagine where you've got a contract that says one thing about extension of time and loss and expense, and says that in circumstances where you as the contractor slow down and suspend works, you're not entitled to either, then there's a nervousness that prevails, and understandably, because you've already got a contractor who's being kept out of his money, who's got an adjudication decision that's that he's seeking to enforce, and probably gaining a nice bill in legal fees, as well as sitting and waiting for his money. The last thing he needs to think is, if I slow down and suspend work, how much is it going to cost me ultimately? So entering into this contract gives, I think, a measure of assurance to stop this practice that regrettably we have seen, where even where the contractor's successful, gets an adjudication claim against them in SIPA, the other party just simply drags their heels and refuses to make good on it, or tries to negotiate, you know, I'll give you 50% of whatever the adjudicator awarded you. So these are all excellent things, I think, in terms of avoiding disputes on the one hand, and seeking to resolve disputes quickly and expeditiously and fairly during the course of the contract. In terms of other ways in which I think, as I say, I think this actually, speaking to those people who've not heard of the standard AIAC standard form contract, I would say use it. It's to me, it's neutral, it's fair. As Stephen says, it may not always be offered to you, but where it is, I think it's an excellent one to enter into. But if I was nitpicking a little bit, one thing that I would like to see as author of a book on mediation is mediation made mandatory. So it's discussed in the contract. The key form of dispute resolution is arbitration. That's the go-to under the contract, with mediation mentioned in the following clause under the contract as a possibility if the parties are willing to do it. Now, the main obstacle to the success of mediation is getting the agreement of the parties, because once people are in a dispute, nobody wants to suggest it because it looks weak, and where it's suggested, nobody wants to take it up because it looks like you're not confident in your case, is the perception. But we've seen in countries like Australia that where mediation is mandatory and they're actually forced into a room to negotiate and discuss, that it's successful even in those circumstances about 55–60% of the time. So if we can get parties to agree to it at the time of entering into the contract, where everybody feels nice and warm and optimistic, then it becomes the default position, and it's I think would be so helpful in terms of allowing contractors to resolve disputes in a way that doesn't drag things unnecessarily for an extended period of time and take a lot of time and money to resolve. So I do appreciate where it fails, it's another layer of cost, but the statistics show it's successful more often than it's not. And where it's successful, it's hugely advantageous for the parties who enter into it. So those are my comments. I'm conscious of the time. I think I probably ran over slightly.
Thank you very much, Louise. Now, ladies and gentlemen, now you have heard from 3 different angles of that same construction industry. I don't know where you particularly sit, or whether you're actually outside of those particular views, but suffice to say that everybody has a different take on the same contract. Now, we're going to run, you've heard from all everybody now, and we're going to run a second poll question. And whilst this poll question is being run, I'll offer you some comments of my own as well from two perspectives, and I'll come to that. So Daniel, could we run the second poll question, please? So ladies and gentlemen, you've heard, and those of you who didn't know about the SFC, you now know about it. Those of you who have heard about it have heard a little bit more about the views about it. So the question becomes, at the end of it, do you think that it will be widely used? Yes, no, don't know. So whilst you're answering this question, and I can see here, host and panelists is not allowed to vote. Whilst you're answering these questions, I will leave that up for a little while. I'd like to offer you a few comments of my own. The first one is that, as many of you know, I've got a lot of gray hairs, and that's because I've been in this industry somewhat longer than many of you. And long enough to remember the late 90s when we spent a lot of time working on the CIDB 2000 building form of contract. Now, if you don't know about the AIAC SFC, I bet you most of you don't even know about the CIDB form. But the CIDB form in those days, in 1999 and 2000, was seen as contractor friendly. Why? Because it had things like the contract administrator had a specific time in order to respond to application, let's say for extension of time from the contractor. So it was seen as an affront, perhaps to the consultants who say that, my goodness, you're telling me that I have to answer the contractor's application within a certain time. Now, that was a long time ago. That was 21 years ago. And over the course of these last 21 years, we've seen more and more procedure. And this is something that Isaac touched on. You know, we've seen the PAM form move very heavily towards more procedure, a lot more precision. Even international forms like FIDIC in 2017 have gone to what will be commonly known as very, very procedural forms. The other perspective I wanted to offer you in terms of what all my colleagues here were talking about is that all of you ultimately will go before an arbitrator if everything goes wrong, if the disputes are not resolved. Many of you will know that having spent over 30 years as a lawyer, I now have moved to the other side of the table. I don't sit as a lawyer anymore. I sit purely as an arbitrator. And I cannot even begin to tell you the relief that I feel when somebody like Stephen Shee walks into my office as a lawyer saying that there was a flood. Everybody knows there was a flood, but we didn't give the notice. And now you're telling me that this is time barred? And how do you then work around that? Whereas as an arbitrator, I look at things that are presented, I look at the contract, I look at the facts, I look at the law, and it is what it is. I'm not trying, I'm not tasked with trying to get around it. So the point I make here is that when you have a lot more guidance, and this is where you call it procedure, you call it guidance, you call it clarity, all my colleagues have used those words, then basically there is more clarity. I know what to do. I know what is right, what is allowed, what's not allowed. And this is what Louise was talking about with respect to that. In that sense, you know, it gives more guidance to the consultant, as Isaac mentioned, to the contractor, as Stephen mentioned, that he's trying to, perhaps advocate some changes, and to Louise, who's arguing the case for you. So, you know, is this a good thing? I would offer you a comment that yes, it is, but good or bad is always seen through your personal eyes and your personal set of circumstances. So I don't believe at the end of the day that one size fits all, but at least today you have heard all the different aspects of the good and bad and pros and cons of this contract. So enough of talking on my part. Let's have a poll result and let's see what is the predicted future of the AIAC standard form of contract. Ooh, very interesting. Mr. Consultant, Isaac, what do you think of this? You're muted, Isaac.
I think I expected results like this. It's a slight majority telling, yes, And of course, there's also the substantial number who don't know. This is because the form of contract is new, and people are just getting used to this type of form of contract, especially in the private sector, where I think this form of contract, if at all, is the private sector that would adopt this type of course, you're challenging with the PAM suite of contracts. But contractors nowadays are not like the yesterday contractors who don't have influence. So times are changing. Contractors can actually make a stand and say, look, if you want me to build this project, it is my terms. Can you change the contract? That is a growing trend. It's not like it used to be. Whatever the developer were to put in, then you have to accept. That's
okay. So I'm going to stop you there, Isaac, because this is completely contrary to what Stephen was talking about. He's basically saying that you take it or you leave it. So Stephen, when you look at this really split result that we have here about the future of the AIC standard form, what are your thoughts?
Okay, I do not have a crystal ball. I would say the AIC form may not be widely used today, but I would say it's a good step. It's another option put forward to the industry, and it may lead to big changes in the future.
Ever the optimist. That's why you can retain your position as a contractor and not leave the industry altogether. Louise,
all the time.
Louise, what do you think? Because I mean, frankly speaking, I'm surprised to see this even split of people's crystal ball gazing.
Yeah, as am I really. I think it's difficult for me as a lawyer who particularly dealing with disputes, because I get involved when everything's gone wrong. So I'm not there on the ground when the negotiations are taking place. But I wonder, and maybe Stephen can help with this. What made PAM, for instance, so successful as a standard form? And what's the difference between that and the AIAC standard form? Like, why do you think one is more palatable than the other, or more widely used than the other?
Stephen, you're gonna go with that?
I think
let me put it another way, Stephen. Since you're a contractor, why are you as a contractor always being forced to use the PAM form?
I wouldn't say it's been forced. It's been something that's been, I think it's not within the control of a contractor. Usually the tender has been drawn up, including a particular form, and the contractor is usually asked to tender for it. And more of the time they say, either you put in a compliant tender, or sometimes they allow some leeway to give the non-compliant, but that one is more for certain design purposes. So I would say that the ground rules are set already. It's for just a contractor just to build in, and that's about it.
So my take on that is that the reason why the PAM form is so widely used is because very often the architect is the first consultant on the project, because they're the ones who start doing the early feasibilities. They're the ones who start doing the early concept design, shall we call it. And invariably, they're the ones who select the form. Now, you've got to take into account that a lot of architects are not well trained in contract administration, because a lot of them are actually focused on the design aspect of it to make things look really beautiful. And I think that Kuala Lumpur skyline reflects that. So, they default to that PAM form. But this is where I'm going to ask Isaac to weigh in. That was then, this is now. Do you see that this is likely to be a difference? I mean, you mentioned that the contractor has got a lot more of a say. Do you think the consultants can drive this much more away from the traditional use of PAM form?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Swee Im. Actually, the use of the form, I mean, in the old days, why they used the PAM form was they had no other competing forms in the industry. Basically, it was, and also the first point of contact to build any building was the consultant, which is the architect. So if somebody wants to build a building, he sees an architect. But today, if you look at it, when somebody wants to build a building, he goes straight to the contractor. And then, he makes, he gets advice. Even the governments are doing this increasingly, You see the skyline today, Gamuda is actually a contractor, but they're the one who are the PDP, the project development partners. They are no more using consultants as the first point of contact. So initially, private sector, of course, initially in the private sector, it was always the architect was the first point of contact, and therefore, and also he's the leader of the consultants. Under him, he engages the other consultants, the mechanical engineers, civil, as well as the QS. So it was tradition, and of course, over the years, there is DB came up the form of contract, and then of course, AIAC. So the future is open to be seen, and as contractors are sizable now than before, they are very big now, so they can actually determine type of contract that a particular client wants to use. Not all of them go for competitive bid. There are a substantial number of contractors who are actually picked for their reputations to complete the job. Then of course the contracts can be, they can demand what sort of contract they put in. Of course, what Stephen is saying is a competitive bid. Of course, then you have not much choice because that is already set there. You just put the price there. Those are much more.
I love the fact that the JKR headquarters is at IJM Design and Build. You now, because Isaac suggesting that as a contractor that's got a reputation for completion, which I believe that Sunway very much falls into that category. I'm going to put it over to you. Do you feel that you've got the empowerment that Isaac seems to suggest?
Obviously, the empowerment comes in some of the contracts where the contractor have a say. Is where contracts that they give some input in on the financing matters. That's when they have some negotiation powers. Other than that, if it's just a conventional build type of contract, it's very, very difficult based on the forms that have been set, the culture, the procurement that we have been practicing over the years. I think it's quite difficult.
Okay, so in the chat box, you see a comment which says that in the private sector, architects seem to be the primary driver. And then the question is posed that, how many architects are there in the audience today? And so far, there's only one who has dared to acknowledge themselves as an architect. So I think that we are in a situation whereby there is a lot of room for us to grow, a lot of room for us to develop. And, in any development, I think that there are good and bad. There's a lot of growing pains. But the question is whether we are willing to do that. And I'm going to offer the fact that at the end of the day, it takes everybody. And today's panel has been selected to offer you different views. Some of the views that have been provided in the chat box are from people who are not within either the consultancy or the legal or the contractor, or indeed the arbitrator like myself. But nevertheless, there's a lot of room for us to develop, and perhaps all these drastic changes that we've actually been experiencing in the last 2 years, primarily the pandemic, but as Louise says, you have the floods on top of the pandemic. That is really quite devastating. Now, will that actually cause us all to change our mindset and put us out into the blue yonder? So, ladies and gentlemen, we are now 1 minute to the top of the hour, and I don't want to cause any further webinar fatigue. So I am actually going to just close off by asking each of my colleagues for some closing remarks that they may have. And in this case, I'm going to go in reverse order. The prettiest and the youngest goes first. Louise.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Isaac. Thank you, Swee. Yeah, final closing remarks. Just perhaps what's needed is just maybe more education in terms of what's out there, it seems. Perhaps PAM is the go-to because, as we all do, we go with what's familiar, but these kinds of webinars educate us about what's out there, what's available, and certainly in respect of this particular form, I think it's very well drafted, fair, neutral, and I would recommend it to anybody who's thinks it's right for their project.
Thank you, Louise. And I'm going to take that as a sign of you volunteering actually to be part of that whole educational program and to be giving more talks about this and to be able to delve deeper into each of the standard forms, because I mean, obviously today we've not been had a chance to go really deep into it. Now, I'm going to go to Isaac next because just for a change, unlike most other contracts, I'm going to give the contractor the last word, not the consultant. So Isaac, you go first, and then Stephen can.
Here's the last say. Okay,
yeah, have the last one. Yes.
No, I would think that I mean it's an innovative form of contract. Is procedural, and you know, I may even want to use the word prescriptive because these procedural rules are actually serious rules which are embedded in the contract, and of course, when you go to court, they will ask you that parties have agreed to all these clauses to follow. So, well, it can be tedious, but I think it's better to have a sort of agreement for like this for the CA or the SO to follow, so that there are less, I mean, lesser issues, lesser issues than what you commonly encounter, and I think the best of all is that it is free. It is also a modular. You can amend, delete, and you can form a clean copy of it to suit your particular project. Of course, not forgetting one other thing, that no matter what forms of contract that you use in industry, the initiator of the project, the employer, must have his funding in place. There are a lot of projects actually. I mean, I've done a lot of projects under central bank, under the project known as TPPT, abandoned projects. When central bank was funding it and the industry knew about it, we very seldom had great disputes. And whatever minor disputes we had, we would actually mediate in an informal manner in the 90s. So money is actually very important form of contract. Is also equally important to guide whoever is administrator, the contract administrator, implement the project fairly. I think the word fairly is very important. If people do recognize administrator who's fair, and if he's fair all the time, then people will actually sort of follow through with him. So that's my.
Thank you, Isaac. Stephen, this is your big chance. Contractor gets
Okay.
You get to issue the final certificate.
Thank you. Thank you, Swee. Okay, I think the standard form is all about balancing rights, obligations, and risk between the players. Most standard forms, I think, they have that as their intention and their noble aim, and that is to avoid and reduce disputes. However, it's when people interference comes in, attitudes, characters, or for certain policy reasons, players can either give the contract the breath of life or the kiss of death. The players to determine that. And I think attitudes, I would fully agree with Louise just now. It has to go through a long process of continuous education, cultural changes, and that would take time. I don't know whether I'll be able to say it, but I think just one concluding statement is all about the art of balancing the expectations of the players and in it, the relationship between them. Maybe AIC should look at the partnering concept in its next endeavors. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much to Isaac, to Louise, and to Stephen for joining us today. To all of you who are out there, the 170 people out there, thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry we've not been able to go into great detail, but perhaps if there is interest, I am sure that my colleagues and myself will be able to have another event where we can actually dissect some of the clauses and some of the policies that are on offer here. What I would like to say is that in the chat box was a comment to say that the contracts that go into dispute are those that are not properly administered. And that is certainly very, very true. And I mean, that's certainly what I've seen over the many years that I've been dealing with this kind of issues. So the partnering concept, the fact that remembering the fact that we are all in this together, we are actually building and achieving a project together as opposed to them versus us, we trying to get one over you, you trying to get one over the other person, and so on and so forth. Actually, we all have to keep remembering that this is actually a single endeavor. Now, one parting shot I'm going to have is the fact that even if you don't get a chance to use the AIAC, standard form of contract, even if you haven't heard about it before, even if you ask somebody to adopt it and you are rejected, my suggestion to you is that you can always use this as a form of guidance to see what's available out there, to see, for example, what other people are thinking in how to administer an extension of time clause, or it doesn't really matter what it is, but to see and use that as a form of guide. The other one that you can also turn to are things like the CIDB 2000, but there's a lot of similarity here. All I'm saying here is that just because you don't get a chance to use it isn't a reason for you not to pick it up, not to know a bit more about it, because, ladies and gentlemen, there's always tomorrow, and there's always a brighter tomorrow. So from all of us here, thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to hand you back to our MC, Kai Jun. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful session.